Kevin Roos, he analyzed several years of data from a single YouTube user. I can't remember his name. His last name is Kane, though. And he turned over his YouTube history to Kevin Roos, and he basically did an analysis of how he became radicalized online. All of the pink are the right-wing content that he viewed, and all of the purple are the intellectual dark web content that he viewed. And so it just encourages, it brings you further and further out, not because it wants you to become extreme, but because they just want you to spend more time on the platform. It's actually agnostic. So we did this again at the societal level, and we were thinking specifically about the impact on journalism when it comes to social media. So you have the mass death of regional independent press, and this was taken from a couple of studies, one from George Washington University, a researcher called Danny Hayes, and Jennifer Lawless of American University. So you have the mass death of regional independent press leads to the reduction of attention on local news and issues, leads to a reduction in local civic involvement, leads to a reduction in well-functioning government. It actually said when there's less media paying attention to what local government is doing, there's more graft. So what that leads to is a reduction in trust in government and democracy because people start thinking, well, even my local government is corrupt, which leads to a rise of populist governments, which leads to populist government targeting the press, which leads to further mass death of regional and independent press. And you see this play out, not just, I mean, when we say populist, we're thinking automatically of our, administration, but it plays out in a far more extreme way in places like the Philippines. So Duterte, the president there, has used Facebook as a weapon in terms of like turning trolls onto journalists. And this is Maria Reza, who's been arrested 2 times this year now and a few times last year. And so it's become a really dangerous environment for free speech. So using all those kinds of what we would call the symptoms of the system, we then identify root cause. Like, why are all of those things happening? I think we can kind of pretty much assume that there's a straight line, right? So if you look at time spent on platform, that leads to attention to sell. And Tim Wu is a writer who's done a lot, who's written a lot around how our attention is sold online. And that leads to an increase in advertising revenue, which leads to further investment in growth of the company and the platform, which leads to an increase of user-based growth, which leads to precision and micro-targeting, which leads to sensationalist content driving engagement, which leads to time spent on platform. Not that you need to understand the whole thing, but basically within the root cause loop, the 2 root causes are time spent on platform and user-based growth. And in fact, a lot of social media companies look at user-based growth. It's almost like monthly active users and daily active users have become separate from profit. And I think maybe it's not even in social media companies, it's also in companies like Uber, right? Because you get into an Uber and every ride is subsidized. And that's because they're chasing user growth at the expense of revenue. So it's kind of funny how those have actually become disentangled. It's actually kind of topsy-turvy if you think about it. So even though we went ahead and, it's not loading. Even though we went ahead and did this and just you can see it categorically and you can look at the whole system online, we wanted to think about okay, well, as a designer, I'm not going to use this system to look explicitly at how I'm going to actively disrupt loops. I kind of don't have the time to do that kind of analysis in order to see the cascading effects. But I think this is a good way as a lead-in to more of an explicit human-centered design perspective. So the last thing we did was prioritize types of interventions. Now, we came up with 3. Not all of them are product or service oriented, but I think that's part of the point of doing system analysis, is that you have to be able to look at policy as a good example of design. So thoughtful regulation and policy change would be one, reforming how social networks measure success is another, and a new philosophy of user experience and behavioral incentives. And so I can talk a little bit about each of these. We gave ourselves how might we questions. So how might policymakers create an environment in which data privacy is a fundamental human right? And how might government foster industry competition? And then we looked at, like, specifically which nodes in the root cause would these approaches, if done right, would disrupt. And you kind of see a lot of these ideas gaining traction now. So in March, I spoke at UX Copenhagen, and like the big news there was just like how everyone was dealing with GDPR and how user experience and product design has changed as a result of that. And the key thing about GDPR is that it really looks at data privacy as a fundamental human right, which is really different than how we look at data privacy in the States. It's a commodity. And in terms of growth or fostering competition, you see even people like Chris Hughes, who's co-founder of Facebook, who left, and then basically the next week just, I don't know, threw a grenade at the company basically by writing a huge opinion piece in the New York Times saying it's time to break up Facebook. So all the wolves are coming out and being like, break it up. Elizabeth Warren is also on that. And then you see it manifested also in product design. So this is, I'm sure you guys have seen this if you have an iPhone or a Mac. It's Apple's data and privacy screen. And what's notable about this is that they actually have a line in there that says, Apple believes privacy is a fundamental human right, so every Apple product is designed to minimize the collection and use of your data. And that's really significant, because once you start thinking about something as a human right, you stop thinking about it as monetizable. So it's an interesting move, and it's a move in the right direction. So you see some of these interventions already happening. The second one is reforming how social media or social networks measure success. So how might investors create metrics that emphasize quality rather than quantity of both user engagement and growth? And how might social media companies innovate on business models that are not advertising dependent? So when we talk about user engagement and growth, it's kind of like ties back to the thing I said earlier about not just companies like Facebook or YouTube, but companies like Uber, like they're chasing user growth at the expense of almost basically everything else. So oftentimes they leave up lots of like questionable or toxic content because it continues to draw engagement, right? And that's another thing is we decided to call on our map we decided not to use the term engagement, we use the term time spent on platform, because I think engagement is actually a euphemism for you spending way too much time on your phone or on social media. So this was interesting. Facebook has continued to let the anti-vax propaganda just rage on its platform. I mean, we have an outbreak going on here now. It's just insane. I mean, it's a good example of how information is actually dangerous to public health when it's misinformation. But Pinterest, they did an interesting thing. So they've been trying to solve this problem with machine learning, trying to identify what's misinformation, what's not. And eventually they're just like, holy crap, this is like crazy. And we just don't want to encourage the spread of this. So they actually took down anything that, anything related to the search term vaccine or vaccination, because they're like, we're gonna just take it down until we figure it out. So I'm not suggesting that's necessarily a long-term solution from an information standpoint, but it takes a lot of courage to take down something that may actually reduce the time people spend on your platform. And so I feel like this was a long-term play in terms of just their values and the health of their platform. So another way that you see this intervention manifesting is, does anyone know what a zebra is when it comes to companies? It's like the unicorn metaphor taken too far. But anyway, unicorn is like a startup with a $1 billion valuation. There's so many of them now, like can't even count. But there's this growing movement of people who are trying to start zebra companies, and they call them zebra companies because they're black and white, so they're profitable, but they're also good for society. Yeah, it's kind of a ridiculous metaphor, but the idea is that their focus is on sustainable long-term growth and not short-term hyper-growth. So if you've ever I actually sat in on a Facebook quarterly call. No, wait, I listened to it after the fact, now that I think about it. And it was like, it's all about MAUs, monthly active users. So knowing that, there's this movement for companies to focus on more long-term growth rather than like that quarterly hit of like more users, it can prevent them from going to places where they don't have the right context. Like Facebook should not be in Myanmar, right? They should not be in places where they don't have representation or people on the ground. So I think this is like a positive move in the right direction when it comes to interventions. Lastly, we have a new philosophy of user experience and behavioral incentives. So how might social media companies design for bridging diverse people rather than polarizing and driving them apart? And how might social media companies use behavior change models to steer towards healthy relationships with their products? So from a product perspective, you see things now, like for bridging diverse people, you see things like Kialo, which like takes certain ideas and you can post pros and cons for them. I don't think it's a perfect system because like I don't always know where these opinions are coming from or if anything's being gamed, but it's an interesting model in exposing people to different ideas. I think one of the key problems that we found with social media as it exists today is it's really good at helping people bond with like-minded people in order to kind of like trash people who are not like them. And so that's like super like how people bond, right? Like it's like an actual like evolutionary thing. We're tribal. And so it exacerbates that tendency rather than trying to bridge diverse people. So if you live in a diverse city, you're more likely in real life to encounter diverse people, but that's not going to happen to you on these big platforms because they encourage you to stay on the platform by having your views reinforced and by bonding with people who are like you. You see some good ideas coming out also in the product space. You have like, so many apps have this now. This was on Instagram, where you can manage your time and get a reminder to let you know you've been using it too much. These are kind of like small steps, but they're kind of like maybe pressured steps in the right direction. And then there are sort of bigger movements such as the Center for Humane Technology, which is really pushing for time well spent. So being able to understand your usage and to help product creators like understand the kinds of toxic products that they're creating and the fact that they're addictive, addressing those by way of just criticism and new principles and how they should be operating and more ethical tech. This is kind of like a growing movement. So just to reiterate, the process that we used was to use systems mapping to understand the status quo, to be able to identify root cause, and then be able to prioritize types of interventions. And once you can prioritize these types of interventions, then you can go into a design process that suits you to kind of design for that. So my question for you is, how do you see yourself using systems thinking, or how are you using it now? And yeah, I'd love to know what you guys think about this, or you think that is applicable in what you're doing today. And this is where you can kind of find, if you feel like reading a 50-page white paper, be my guest. I actually met a couple of people, so we had this event called All Tech is Human in May, and I met a couple of people who had read it, and I was like, you're the one. Read it, cover to cover. Thank you.